When Samuel Cross returned to his Nebraska homestead in 1859, with enough gold to buy half the territory, he expected to find his family celebrating his triumph. Instead, he discovered empty rooms, abandoned dreams, and graves that bore his parents' names. What he found buried beneath years of guilt and loss would either destroy him completely or teach him that true wealth was never about the fortune he'd left home to find. But would he realize it before losing the one person who could show him the way back to himself? Samuel Cross's horse kicked up clouds of dust as thunder rumbled overhead, but the storm brewing in the Nebraska sky couldn't match the one building in his chest. 5 long years had passed since he'd ridden away from Cedar Creek Valley with empty pockets and a head full of dreams. And now he was coming home with more money than most men saw in 3 lifetimes. The November wind of 1859 bit through his expensive wool coat as his black stallion climbed the final hill before home. Samuel adjusted the leather saddlebags that clinked softly, with each step bags heavy enough with gold coins to buy every ranch in 3 counties. His polished boots, fine hat, and the silver watch chain gleaming against his vest told everyone who looked that Samuel Cross had made something of himself out in California. But success felt strange, sitting on his shoulders as he crested Willow Ridge and looked down into the valley where he'd grown up. The familiar sight of rolling grassland stretched out below him, dotted with cattle, and crossed by the winding creek that gave the area its name. Somewhere down there, past the line of cottonwood trees, stood the 2-story farmhouse where his mother used to ring the dinner bell, and his father would wave from the fields. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs like a blacksmith's hammer. Would they even recognize him? The scared 20-year-old boy who'd left with calloused hands and patched pants had returned as a man who owned 3,000 head of cattle and employed dozens of ranch hands. His reflection in store windows back in Sacramento showed a confident businessman with steady eyes and a firm handshake that sealed deals worth more money than his whole hometown had ever seen. The stallion snorted and shook his head, eager to reach the barn where Samuel had learned to ride on an old mare named Buttercup. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. But maybe that happened when you'd spent 5 years looking at mountains and endless California ranges. The Henderson place to the east seemed to have grown, with new barns and fences stretching further than before. Good for them, Samuel thought. Prosperity should lift everyone up. As he guided his horse down the familiar dirt road, Samuel's mind raced through the conversations he'd practiced during the long journey home. He'd tell his father about the drought that had killed half the California herds, creating the perfect opportunity for a smart buyer. He'd describe the railroad deals and the military contracts that had multiplied his investment 10 times over. Most importantly, he'd explain how he could now save their family farm and buy up enough surrounding land to create the biggest cattle operation in Nebraska territory. His mother would cry, of course. Mary Cross had always been the emotional one, tears flowing whether she was happy, sad, or just overwhelmed by Sunday's sermon. Samuel smiled, thinking about how she'd fuss over his clothes and insist on cooking his favorite meals for a week straight. She'd probably invite half the county over to show off her successful son the way she used to display his school prizes on the mantelpiece. The road curved past Miller's Pond, where Samuel had caught his first fish and learned to skip stones. Old Man Miller's cabin looked exactly the same, right down to the crooked chimney that had been threatening to fall down for as long as Samuel could remember. Some things never changed, which felt comforting after 5 years of constant motion and new faces. But other things had changed. Samuel noticed several farms that looked abandoned, with broken fences and weeds growing where crops should be. The Morrison place showed no signs of life, and the Jeffries cabin had boards nailed over its windows. Maybe the harsh winter of '57 that he'd heard about had hit harder than people let on in their letters. His father's last letter, received 6 months ago in California, had mentioned difficult times, but assured Samuel that the Cross family was managing fine. Jonathan Cross had never been one to complain or ask for help, even when help was desperately needed. Pride ran deep in the Cross bloodline, sometimes too deep for their own good. The familiar outline of his childhood home appeared through the trees, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The two-story house, with its wraparound porch and stone chimney, looked exactly like the picture he'd carried in his mind through every lonely night in California. Smoke should be rising from that chimney on a cold November afternoon. His mother's vegetable garden should be showing the brown remains of harvested crops. Instead, Samuel saw only stillness. The windows stared back at him like empty eyes, reflecting the gray afternoon sky. No horses stood in the corral. No chickens pecked in the yard. The front gate hung open on rusted hinges, creaking back and forth in the wind like a door to an abandoned church. Samuel's stallion slowed to a walk without being asked, as if the animal sensed something wrong. The rich smell of success that had surrounded Samuel for months suddenly felt thin as prairie air. All the gold in his saddlebags couldn't fill the hollow feeling growing in his chest as he approached the place that was supposed to welcome him home as a conquering hero. Something was very, very wrong at the Cross family farm. Samuel's boots hit the ground with a thud that echoed across the empty yard, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence that wrapped around his childhood home like a burial shroud. The confident stride he'd perfected in California business meetings faltered as he approached the front porch where his father used to sit every evening, whittling small animals for the neighbor children. The porch boards sagged under accumulated snow and debris from previous storms. Paint peeled from the shutters in long strips that fluttered in the wind like skin hanging from old bones. 3 roof shingles lay scattered in the overgrown grass, and the front door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello?" Samuel called, his voice cracking like a teenager's. The word disappeared into the wind without an echo. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Father? Mother? It's Samuel!" Nothing answered him except the creak of the loose gate and the whistle of wind through the broken fence posts. Samuel's expensive leather gloves trembled as he pushed open the front door, which groaned on hinges that hadn't seen oil in months. The smell hit him first, not the familiar sense of his mother's cooking and his father's pipe tobacco, but the musty odor of abandonment. Dust particles danced in the pale afternoon light that filtered through dirty windows, settling on furniture covered with yellowed sheets like ghosts at a dinner party. Samuel stepped carefully across the threshold, his polished boots leaving prints in the thick dust that coated the wooden floor. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 3:30, though whether that meant morning or afternoon or even what day, he couldn't tell. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like silver thread, and mouse droppings dotted the floor near the kitchen doorway. "This can't be right," Samuel whispered to himself, his voice sounding strange in the empty house. His parents weren't the type to leave without word. Jonathan Cross had been born in this house, and Mary Cross had declared more than once that they'd carry her out of it feet first before she'd live anywhere else. The kitchen told the same story of abandonment. Pots and pans sat clean but dusty on their shelves. The wood-burning stove was cold, and had been for some time, judging by the spider web stretched across its door. His mother's favorite coffee cup sat on the table, a thin film of dust coating its blue flowers. Samuel climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, each step creaking under his weight. His own bedroom looked exactly as he'd left it 5 years earlier, except for the dust and the musty smell of disuse. The quilt his grandmother had sewn still covered the narrow bed, and his old clothes hung in the wardrobe like the belongings of a ghost. His parents' bedroom showed more signs of recent use. The bed was unmade, and clothes lay scattered on the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry. But even here, dust had settled on everything, and the air tasted stale and forgotten. Back downstairs, Samuel searched through drawers and cupboards, looking for some clue about where his family had gone. In his father's desk, he found the account books that recorded the farm's struggles, Pages of careful entries showing smaller and smaller profits, bigger and bigger debts. The final entry was dated March of 1858, nearly 2 years ago. A folded piece of paper tucked between the pages caught his attention. Samuel unfolded it with shaking hands and read his father's familiar handwriting. Bank payment overdue again. Henderson offered to buy the debt, but I won't sell to that snake. Samuel will come home soon with enough money to save us. I know he will. The paper crumpled in Samuel's fist as the full weight of realization crashed down on him. His parents had lost the farm, but where had they gone? Why hadn't they written to tell him? His last letter from his father had mentioned hard times, but nothing about losing their home. Samuel stumbled back outside, his chest tight with panic. The late afternoon sun slanted across the empty yard, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at him. All his success, all his wealth, all his grand plans to save the family farm, they'd come too late. You looking for the Cross family, mister? Samuel spun around, his heart hammering. A young woman emerged from behind the old barn, moving carefully with the help of a wooden crutch tucked under her left arm. Her simple brown dress was patched but clean, and her dark hair was pulled back with a faded blue ribbon. Despite her obvious physical challenges, she carried herself with quiet dignity. I'm Samuel Cross, he managed to say, touching the brim of his hat out of habit. This is my family's place. Was my family's place. The woman's brown eyes widened with recognition, and something that might have been pity. Samuel, Lord Almighty, I heard stories about you for years. I'm Catherine Mills. My father works the Henderson spread down in the valley. She paused, studying his expensive clothes and the fine horse behind him. I'm afraid I have some news that's going to be mighty hard for you to hear. Samuel's knees felt weak as water. The gold in his saddlebags suddenly felt heavier than mountains, and all his California confidence crumbled like sandcastles in the Nebraska wind. Whatever Catherine Mills was about to tell him, he knew it would change everything he thought he knew about coming home. But did he have the courage to hear the truth about what had happened to his family while he was off making his fortune? A child's laughter pierced the afternoon silence, echoing from somewhere beyond the empty barn like a ghost from Samuel's past. He spun toward the sound, his heart jumping, as memories flooded back. Had he once played in that very spot with wooden horses and rope lassos? The laughter came again, closer now, followed by the rhythmic thump of something wooden against hard-packed earth. You looking for the Cross family, mister? Samuel turned to find a young woman emerging from behind the weathered barn, her movements careful but determined. She couldn't have been more than 22, with kind brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets and sorrows far beyond her years. A wooden crutch supported her left side, its worn handle polished smooth by countless hours of use. Her simple blue dress bore patches at the elbows, but every stitch was neat and purposeful, the work of someone who took pride in making do with little. I'm Samuel Cross, he said, removing his hat in a gesture his mother had drilled into him years ago. This was my home. The woman's eyes widened like she'd seen a spirit walk out of the prairie mist. Her free hand flew to her throat, clutching at a small silver locket that caught the dying sunlight. Samuel, Lord Almighty, I'm Catherine Mills. My pa works the Henderson spread down the valley. She paused, studying his fine clothes and the gold watch chain glinting across his vest. Your father spoke of you often, especially during the long evenings when the work was done. Something in her voice made Samuel's stomach clench with dread. The way she said spoke instead of speaks, past tense final as a coffin nail. Where is he? Where's my family? Catherine shifted her weight, the crutch creaking softly. Behind her, a small boy with dirt-streaked cheeks peered around the barn corner, clutching a carved wooden horse that looked suspiciously familiar. Samuel's breath caught. He'd owned a toy just like that, carved by his father's patient hands during the long winter evenings of his childhood. That's my nephew, Danny, Catherine said, following Samuel's gaze. Been staying with me since his ma took sick last month. She whistled softly, and the boy scampered away toward a modest cabin that Samuel hadn't noticed before, a new addition to the property, built where his mother's flower garden once bloomed. "You've been living here?" Samuel asked, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. "Someone had to tend the place," Catherine replied simply. "Your father made me promise, near the end. Said his boy would come home someday, and the land should be waiting." She gestured toward the main house with its sagging porch and peeling paint. "I've done what I could, but a woman with one good leg can only manage so much." The casual way she mentioned her disability struck Samuel like a physical blow. In California, he'd grown accustomed to people who hid their weaknesses behind masks of success and bravado. Here stood someone who acknowledged her limitations without shame or self-pity, as natural as commenting on the weather. "What happened to your leg?" he asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Catherine's smile held no bitterness. "Horse threw me when I was 16, broke it in 3 places, and the bone doctor in town wasn't much good. Pa wanted to send me east to a real hospital, but we couldn't spare the money." She shrugged, as if discussing someone else's misfortune. "Funny how life works. That accident led me to your father. Couldn't help with heavy farm work anymore, so I started doing washing and mending for folks. Your pa was my first customer." Samuel felt a stab of guilt so sharp it nearly knocked him backward. While he'd been building his fortune in California, his father had been taking in laundry from a disabled woman who needed the work. The contrast between his success and his family's struggle felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. "I need to know," he said quietly. "What happened to them?" Catherine's expression grew gentle, but grave. "I'm afraid I have news that might be hard to hear." She glanced toward the setting sun, its orange light painting long shadows across the neglected yard. "But it's not a story for standing in the cold. Come inside, and I'll put on some coffee. You look like a man who's traveled far and needs to sit down for what I have to tell you." As she led him toward the small cabin, Samuel noticed details that spoke of careful maintenance despite limited resources. The steps were solid beneath his feet, the door hung straight on its hinges, and warm light glowed through clean windows. Whatever had happened to his family, Catherine Mills had been a faithful guardian of their memory. The cabin's interior surprised him with its warmth and order. Hand-sewn quilts covered simple furniture, and the smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. A photograph sat prominently on the mantelpiece, his parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful. Beside it stood his father's old pipe and his mother's favorite teacup, arranged like shrine offerings. "Sit," Catherine said, indicating a chair by the fireplace, while she moved efficiently around the small kitchen, despite her crutch. "Danny, go wash up for supper." The boy appeared from a back room, still clutching his wooden horse. He studied Samuel with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you the rich son?" he asked. "The one who went away to find gold?" "Danny," Catherine's voice carried gentle reproach. "It's all right," Samuel said, though the child's innocent words stung. "Yes, I suppose I am." He looked at the boy more carefully, noting the intelligent eyes and stubborn set to his jaw. "What's your name, son?" "Daniel James Mills. But everyone calls me Danny. Aunt Catherine says, you used to live here when you were little like me." "I did." Samuel's throat felt tight. "I played with a horse just like that one." Danny held up the carved toy. "Grandpa Jonathan made this for me. He said his boy used to have one too, but he took it with him when he went away." The child's matter-of-fact tone carried no judgment, but Samuel felt it like an accusation. Catherine placed a steaming cup of coffee in Samuel's hands, the warmth seeping through the ceramic into his chilled fingers. "Your father kept your room just as you left it," she said softly. "Even when times got hard and he could have rented it out, he said you'd be back when you were ready." Samuel stared into the dark coffee, seeing his own reflection wavering in the surface. "I wrote letters," he said defensively. "I sent money when I could." "I know." He treasured every word. Catherine settled into the chair across from him, her crutch propped within easy reach. But letters aren't the same as presents, are they? And money can't fill an empty chair at the supper table. The simple truth of her words hit harder than any accusation. Samuel had spent 5 years proving himself to strangers while the people who already believed in him waited patiently for his return. Now he was afraid to ask how long they'd waited, and whether his success had come too late to matter. Outside, the Nebraska wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding him of countless evenings when he'd sat by this same fire, listening to his parents plan for tomorrow, while the prairie night sang its lonely song around their small sanctuary of warmth and love. Catherine's coffee cup trembled in her hands as she set it down, the delicate china making a sound like a funeral bell against the wooden table. Samuel watched her face carefully, reading the sorrow she tried to hide behind gentle smiles and steady words. Danny had fallen asleep in the corner chair, his wooden horse clutched protectively to his chest, innocent of the weight of adult grief that filled the small cabin like smoke. The winter of 1857 came early and stayed late, Catherine began, her voice barely above a whisper. October snow caught everyone unprepared, and by November, the drifts reached the windows. Your father had sold most of the cattle the year before to pay debts, so there wasn't much income coming in. Samuel's chest tightened. He remembered that autumn he'd been celebrating his first major cattle sale in California, toasting his success in a warm hotel, while his parents faced the harsh reality of Nebraska winter with empty pockets. Pa offered your father work at the Henderson place, but Jonathan was too proud to leave the homestead. Said his boy would be back come spring with enough money to set things right. Catherine's fingers traced the rim of her cup. He wasn't wrong about you making money, was he? What happened? Samuel forced the words past the growing lump in his throat. Catherine rose slowly, using her crutch to steady herself as she moved to the window. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the prairie gold, the same color as the coins weighing down Samuel's saddlebag's wealth that had arrived years too late. The influenza came with the January thaw, she said without turning around, started in town and spread like wildfire through the isolated farms. Your mother caught it first. She'd been helping nurse the Brennan children when their whole family took sick. Samuel closed his eyes, seeing his mother's face clearly for the first time in years. Mary Cross had never turned away from anyone in need, even when her own family barely had enough to survive. Her compassion had been both her greatest strength and, apparently, her doom. Your father tended her day and night, Catherine continued. Wouldn't let anyone else near the house for fear of spreading the sickness. I left food on the porch step and heard him talking to her through the window, reading from her favorite psalms, telling her stories about you and your adventures in California. Did she? Samuel couldn't finish the question. She passed on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Catherine's voice broke slightly. Your father buried her behind the house, in that little grove of cottonwoods she loved, carved her headstone himself, working through the night with frost on his hands. Samuel stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the energy of grief and guilt coursing through his body. He paced to the fireplace, staring at his parents' wedding photograph. They looked so young, so full of hope and dreams. Had they ever imagined their story would end with one spouse burying the other in frozen ground, while their only child chased fortune 1,000 miles away? And my father? Held on for 3 more weeks. Catherine turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Kept saying he needed to wait for you, that you'd be coming home soon. He had your last letter memorized, the one where you wrote about buying your own ranch. He was so proud, Samuel. Even at the end, wasted away to nothing, he'd tell anyone who'd listen about his successful son. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. His father had died clutching pride in a son who hadn't been there when it mattered most. All the money in his saddlebags couldn't buy back a single day he'd lost with them. Couldn't purchase one more conversation, or shared meal, or moment of simply being present in their lives. I should have come home sooner, he whispered. Should have, could have, Those are words that eat a person alive. Catherine moved to stand beside him, her presence warm and steadying. Your parents knew you loved them. They understood why you left, and they believed in what you were doing. That belief gave them comfort, even in the hardest times. But they died poor because of my choices. If I'd stayed, helped work the ranch, you'd have all starved together, Catherine said firmly. The drought of 56 killed crops across 3 counties. Small ranchers who stayed put lost everything anyway. At least your parents had hope to sustain them. Samuel studied her face in the firelight, seeing strength that humbled him. Here was someone who'd lost her mobility, her prospects for a traditional life, her nephew's mother to illness. Yet she spoke of hope as if it were a tangible gift rather than a cruel illusion. How do you bear it? He asked. The loss, the hardship. How do you keep going? Catherine smiled, and for a moment, the years of struggle fell away from her features. Someone has to tend the flowers on your mother's grave. Someone has to keep your father's stories alive. Someone has to be here when Danny wakes up from nightmares about his mama. She gestured around the small cabin. This place holds memories worth preserving, Samuel. Your parents built something here that can't be measured in dollars. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely call echoing across the vast prairie. Samuel felt the sound in his bones, recognizing it as the voice of his own isolation. He'd spent 5 years surrounded by business associates and social acquaintances, yet he'd been as alone as that prairie wolf singing to an empty sky. Where are they buried? He asked quietly. I'll take you tomorrow, when the light's better. But Samuel, Catherine hesitated, then seemed to gather courage. There's something else you need to know. Something about the land, about why I've really been staying here. The change in her tone made Samuel's stomach clench with fresh dread. What do you mean? Before Catherine could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin, followed by a voice that carried authority and barely concealed menace. Open up in there. Sheriff's business. Danny jerked awake with a startled cry, and Catherine's face went pale as winter sky. Through the window, Samuel could see torchlight flickering in the gathering darkness. Multiple riders, armed and impatient. Whatever Catherine had been about to reveal would have to wait. The past had delivered its blow, but the present was bringing troubles of its own. The morning sun had barely kissed the prairie when trouble came riding hard toward the cemetery. Samuel heard the thunder of hooves before he saw the dust cloud rising from the valley road. 3 men on horseback charged up the hill like they owned everything their horses touched. The leader wore a tin star that caught the early light, but his face held nothing lawful about it. Samuel knelt beside his mother's grave, placing fresh wildflowers Catherine had picked at dawn. The wooden cross cast a thin shadow across the mounded earth. He'd been talking to his parents, telling them about California and the gold mines, about the fortune he'd made too late to save them. Now these riders brought a different kind of trouble. This here's private land now, stranger. The sheriff's voice boomed across the quiet cemetery. His horse snorted and stamped, eager to move. You got about 10 seconds to clear out before we make you clear out. Samuel rose slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. His fine clothes marked him as different from the local farmers. The sheriff's 2 companions spread out on either side, their hands resting on their gun belts. These weren't lawmen keeping peace. They were hired muscle, dressed up with badges. I'm Samuel Cross, he said, keeping his voice steady. These are my parents' graves. Sheriff Keller laughed, a harsh sound that scared the mourning doves from nearby trees. Cross? That dirt farmer's boy who ran off to play cowboy? He spat tobacco juice that landed near Mary Cross's headstone. Your daddy died, owing more money than this worthless plot could ever be worth. The insult hit Samuel like a physical blow. His father had been the hardest working man in 3 counties. Jonathan Cross had built this ranch from nothing, raised cattle when others said the land was too harsh, planted crops when everyone claimed the soil was too poor. He'd given everything to make a life for his family. Watch your tongue when you speak of my father, Samuel warned. Or what? Keller's hand moved to his pistol grip. You gonna cry about it? Maybe run off to California again? Catherine's voice cut through the tension like a church bell. Morning, Sheriff Keller. She emerged from behind a large oak tree, her wooden crutch tapping against the hard ground. Her simple dress was clean but patched, showing the careful mending of someone who made every thread count. Mighty early for you to be this far from town. Stay out of this, girl. Keller's eyes never left Samuel. This ain't your concern. Cemetery's consecrated ground, Catherine replied calmly. She moved to stand beside Samuel, her presence somehow making him feel stronger. Church law says families can visit their dead. Even Sheriff Keller can't change church law. One of the other men, younger with a scraggly beard, shifted nervously in his saddle. Boss? Maybe we should… Shut up, Toby. Keller's face had turned red above his dirty collar. Church law don't pay debts. Henderson wants this land cleared for his cattle. That includes moving these old bones somewhere else. Samuel felt his blood turn to ice water. Moving them. Dead's dead, Keller shrugged. Henderson's got big plans for this valley. Gonna run 1,000 head of cattle through here come spring. Can't have grave markers spooking the herd. The third rider, an older man with gray whiskers, finally spoke up. The debt was $800 when Jonathan died. Interest makes it near $1,500 now. Catherine gasped. Even Samuel, with all his California gold, felt the weight of that number. $1,500 was more money than most folks in the territory would see in 10 years of hard work. Course, if you can't pay, Keller continued with a mean smile, Henderson might let you work it off. 20 years of free labor ought to cover it. Samuel's mind raced. He had the money, more than enough to pay the debt 10 times over. But something about this felt wrong. His father had been careful with money, never borrowed, unless he absolutely had to. $800 was a fortune to a small rancher. What exactly did my father owe money for? Samuel asked. Does it matter? Keller waved his hand dismissively. Dead man's debts pass to his kin. That's the law. I'd like to see the papers, Samuel pressed. In California, he'd learned that crooked deals always fell apart when you demanded to see the actual contracts. Keller's eyes narrowed dangerously. You calling me a liar, boy? The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Samuel felt Catherine's hand brush against his arm, a warning to be careful. These men hadn't come here to collect a debt. They'd come to run him off, maybe permanently if he pushed too hard. But Samuel Cross had spent 5 years facing down claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, and crooked mining officials. He'd learned that bullies were strongest when you showed them fear. I'm not calling you anything, Samuel said quietly. I'm asking to see the legal documents that give you the right to disturb my parents' graves. Legal documents? Keller laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. This is Nebraska territory, not some fancy California courthouse. We handle things simple out here. Simple like cheating dead men out of their final resting place. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun barrel. Keller's face went from red to purple. His hand moved to his pistol, but Catherine stepped forward before anyone could draw iron. Sheriff, she said in her calmest voice, my father works for Henderson. Been breaking horses for him since before I was born. If Henderson really owned this land, don't you think he'd have mentioned it to his own horse trainer? For the first time, doubt flickered in Keller's eyes. Samuel caught the hesitation and pressed his advantage. Here's what we're going to do, Samuel said, reaching into his coat. All 3 riders tensed, hands moving to their weapons. But Samuel only pulled out a leather wallet thick with banknotes. I'll pay the debt. All of it. Right now. He counted out $1,500 in crisp bills. More money than these men had probably seen in one place before. The morning breeze tried to scatter the cash, but Samuel held it firm. But first, he continued, we're going to ride into town and look at those legal papers. If everything's legitimate, you get the money and we settle this peacefully. If the papers don't exist, he let the threat hang unfinished. Keller stared at the money like a snake watching a mouse. Greed warred with caution across his weathered features. "You got yourself a deal, Cross," Keller finally said. "But if you're trying to trick us, the only tricks here are the ones you've been playing on dead men's families," Samuel replied. He folded the money and put it back in his coat. "Lead the way to town, Sheriff. Let's see just how legal this debt really is." The ride into Cedar Creek took nearly an hour, plenty of time for Samuel to study the three men who'd threatened his family's graves. Sheriff Keller rode with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged, his back straight and his head high. But the two men with him seemed less sure of themselves. The younger one, Toby, kept glancing nervously at Samuel, while the older man with gray whiskers rode in thoughtful silence. Cedar Creek had grown since Samuel left in '54. New buildings lined the main street, including a proper bank and a hotel with glass windows. But underneath the fresh paint and new construction, Samuel recognized the same dusty frontier town where he'd bought supplies and sold cattle as a young man. The courthouse stood at the end of Main Street, a two-story building made of local limestone. It was here that all legal documents would be filed, including any legitimate debts against his father's property. Samuel's stomach tightened as they tied their horses to the hitching post out front. "You sure you want to do this, Cross?" Keller asked as they climbed the courthouse steps. "Might be easier to just pay the money and forget about it." "I'm sure," Samuel replied, though his heart was beating fast enough to power a steam engine. The county clerk was a thin man named Peterson, who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and kept his gray hair slicked back with pomade. He looked up from his ledger when the group entered, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the armed sheriff and his deputies. "Morning, Peterson," Keller said with false friendliness. "We need to see the debt records for the Jonathan Cross property." Peterson's pale eyes shifted between the sheriff and Samuel. "Cross property? I'll need to check the files." He disappeared into a back room, leaving the five of them standing in uncomfortable silence. Catherine had followed them into town, arriving just as Peterson returned with a thin folder. She stood near the door, her crutch leaning against the wall, ready to witness whatever they discovered. "Here we are," Peterson said, opening the folder on his desk. "Jonathan Cross, deceased 1857. Let's see." He ran his finger down a page of handwritten entries. Property taxes paid through '58. No outstanding debts listed with the county. Samuel felt a surge of relief. But Keller wasn't finished. "What about private debts?" the sheriff demanded. "Henderson says Cross owed him money for cattle feed and medical bills." Peterson looked confused. "If there were private debts against the property, they'd need to be registered here within 6 months of the death. I don't see any such filings." The silence in the room grew thick as molasses. Toby, the young deputy, shifted his weight from foot to foot like a child who needed to use the outhouse. The older deputy, who'd remained nameless, stared hard at the floor. "Maybe you missed something," Keller suggested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I don't miss things," Peterson replied sharply. He was clearly insulted by the suggestion. "I've been keeping these records for 12 years. If Jonathan Cross owed money to anyone, it would be noted right here in black and white." Samuel stepped forward. "What about the property itself? Who owns it now?" Peterson flipped through several pages. According to the Territorial Land Office, the property passed to Jonathan Cross's heir upon his death. That would be. He looked up at Samuel. "You, I assume? Samuel Cross?" "That's right. Then you own the land free and clear, Mr. Cross. No debts, no liens, no claims against it." The words hit the room like a lightning strike. Samuel owned his childhood home. His parents' graves sat on land that belonged to him, not to Henderson or anyone else. The relief made his knees weak. But Keller wasn't giving up easily. "There's been a mistake," the sheriff insisted. "Henderson has the original loan documents. They're back at his ranch." "Then he should have filed them properly," Peterson said with growing irritation. "The law is clear about these matters. If Mr. Henderson believes he has a legitimate claim, he needs to present the proper documentation to this office." Samuel found his voice. "And until he does?" Until he does, you have every legal right to your property, including the cemetery. The gray-whiskered deputy cleared his throat. Boss, he said quietly to Keller, maybe we should head back and talk to Henderson about this. Keller's face had gone from purple to a sickly green color. He knew he'd been caught in a lie, and everyone in the room knew it too. The question now was whether he'd admit defeat gracefully or try to bluff his way out. This ain't over, Keller muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. Henderson's gonna want to see those records himself. He's welcome to come in any time during business hours, Peterson replied coolly. I'll be happy to show him the same documents I've shown you. As they filed out of the courthouse, Catherine caught up with Samuel on the steps. You did it, she said quietly. You saved your parents' graves. Samuel nodded, but something still bothered him. Why would Henderson try such an obvious lie? He had to know. We'd check the records. Maybe he didn't think you'd bother, Catherine suggested. Or maybe he figured his word as a big landowner would be enough to scare you off. Samuel considered this. Henderson was indeed one of the most powerful men in the territory, with thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle. Men like him were used to getting their way through intimidation and influence. But Samuel Cross wasn't the scared young man who'd left Nebraska 5 years ago. He'd learned to stand up to bullies in the gold camps of California, and he wasn't about to back down now. Let's go home, he said, offering Catherine his arm as they walked toward their horses. Behind them, Sheriff Keller and his deputies mounted up and rode out of town at a gallop, kicking up clouds of dust in their hurry to leave. Samuel watched them go with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He'd won this battle, but something told him the war was far from over. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs as they rode slowly back toward the valley. Samuel felt lighter than he had since returning to Nebraska. His parents could rest in peace, and the land they'd loved would remain in the Cross family. But as they crested the hill overlooking his childhood home, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the direction of his house. The hammer slipped from Samuel's grip, clattering onto the wooden planks below as sweat dripped down his face. 3 weeks had passed since he'd faced down Sheriff Keller, and now the real work began. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as he struggled to nail new shingles onto the schoolhouse roof, his soft California hands already blistered and raw. You're holding it wrong, called a voice from below. Samuel looked down to see old Pete Harrison, a grizzled carpenter who'd helped build half the structures in Cedar Creek Valley. The man's weathered face showed no trace of the respect Samuel had grown used to receiving from his business partners out west. I've built plenty of things, Samuel replied, wiping his brow with his sleeve. Pete chuckled and shook his head. Maybe so, but not with your hands, I'd wager. Come down here before you put a nail through your palm. The next hour proved humbling, as Pete showed Samuel the basics of roofing that any local boy would have learned by age 12. Samuel's expensive clothes grew dusty and torn, his manicured fingernails cracked and dirty, yet something stirring inside him felt more alive than he had in years. Why are you helping me? Samuel asked during a water break. Pete studied him carefully. Your pa was a good man. Helped me through some dark times when my Martha passed. Figure his boy deserves a chance to prove he's cut from the same cloth. By noon, word had spread through the valley that Samuel Cross was working alongside the local men. Instead of just throwing money around, Catherine arrived with a basket of sandwiches and fresh buttermilk, her arrival causing the workers to pause their hammering. How's our city boy doing? She asked Pete with a smile. Better than expected, Pete admitted. Got soft hands, but his heart's in the right place. Catherine climbed the ladder with surprising grace despite her crutch, settling beside Samuel on the partially completed roof. You don't have to prove anything to these people, you know. Don't I? Samuel flexed his aching fingers. I left them behind when things got tough. Now I come back with money, expecting everything to be the same. Things aren't the same, Catherine said gently. The question is whether you can accept what they've become. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached the worksite with hesitant steps. His clothes were patched, and his shoes worn thin, but his eyes held an intelligence that caught Samuel's attention. "Mr. Cross?" the boy said. "I'm Tommy Miller. My ma says you're fixing to reopen the school." Samuel climbed down from the roof, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "That's right. You interested in learning?" Tommy's face lit up. "Yes, sir. I can already read some, and I know my numbers up to 100. Ma taught me when she could, but she's been too sick lately to keep up." Something twisted in Samuel's chest. He remembered being that eager, that hungry for knowledge and opportunity. "Tell you what, Tommy, help us carry supplies today, and I'll make sure you're the first student enrolled when we open." The boy's grin could have powered the whole valley. As the day wore on, more families began stopping by the construction site. Some brought food, others offered labor, and a few just came to watch this strange sight of the valley's richest man working like a common laborer. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, arrived in a fancy carriage that looked out of place among the workhorses and farm wagons. She surveyed the scene with obvious disapproval. "Samuel Cross," she called imperiously, "my husband wishes to speak with you about your activities." Samuel didn't stop working. "Tell your husband he can find me here until sundown. After that, I'll be at the Miller place, checking on a sick woman." Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open. "The Miller place? But they're just tenant farmers." "They're my neighbors," Samuel replied firmly. "And neighbors help neighbors." The woman huffed and departed. But Samuel noticed several of the workers exchanging approving glances. Evening found Samuel and Catherine riding toward the Miller homestead, their horses picking their way carefully along the rutted path. The small cabin sat in a hollow between two hills, smoke rising weakly from its chimney. "Tommy's mother has the lung sickness," Catherine explained. "She's been struggling to keep food on the table since her husband died in a farming accident last spring." Inside the cabin, they found a woman who couldn't have been older than 30, though illness had aged her beyond her years. She tried to rise when they entered, but Samuel gently urged her to stay seated. "Tommy tells me you've been teaching him to read," Samuel said. Mrs. Miller nodded weakly. "I was a teacher back east before I married. Always hoped." She broke into a coughing fit that left her gasping. Samuel and Catherine exchanged glances. Without speaking, they both knew what needed to be done. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel said carefully, "what if I told you the new school needs a teacher? Someone who understands what these children need?" Hope flickered in the woman's eyes. "I couldn't. I mean, my health would improve with proper food and medicine," Catherine finished, "and a purpose worth fighting for." That night, as they rode back through the starlit valley, Catherine was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. "You're not the same man who left here 5 years ago." Samuel considered this. "I'm not sure I was much of a man when I left. Just a scared boy running from responsibility. And now?" He looked out across the land his father had loved, now seeing it through different eyes. "Now I think I'm learning what my father tried to teach me all along. That being rich isn't about what you own, it's about what you give." But as they approached the main house, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks circled the property, and one of his newly repaired fence posts had been deliberately broken. Someone had been watching them. Someone who wasn't pleased with Samuel's return or his growing influence in the valley. The question wasn't who Samuel had a good idea about that. The question was what they planned to do about it, and whether Samuel would be ready when they made their move. Thunder rolled across the valley like cannon fire, and lightning split the night sky as Samuel paced the floor of his father's old study. The storm that had been building all day finally broke just after midnight, but the weather wasn't what kept him awake. 3 windows in the schoolhouse had been smashed during the night, and someone had scattered the construction materials across the yard like scattered bones. Catherine sat in the worn leather chair by the fireplace, her crutch propped against her knee as she sorted through the threatening letters that had been left nailed to trees around the property. Her face remained calm, but Samuel could see the worry in her eyes. "Listen to this one," she said, holding up a paper. "Leave Cedar Creek Valley or face the consequences. Your kind isn't welcome here." Samuel stopped pacing and stared at her. My kind? I was born in this valley. You were born here, Catherine agreed. But you came back different. Some people don't like different. A sharp knock at the front door made them both freeze. Samuel reached for the rifle hanging above the mantelpiece, but Catherine shook her head. If they meant to hurt us, they wouldn't knock, she whispered. Samuel opened the door to find Tommy Miller standing in the pouring rain, soaked to the skin and shivering. The boy's eyes were wide with fear. Mr. Cross, they took her. They took my ma. Samuel pulled the boy inside while Catherine grabbed a blanket. Who took her, Tommy? Start from the beginning. Through chattering teeth, Tommy told them how 3 men on horseback had arrived at their cabin an hour ago. They dragged his mother from her sickbed, claiming she owed money to the bank. When Tommy had tried to stop them, they'd laughed and told him to find Samuel Cross if he wanted to see her again. This is about me, Samuel said grimly. Henderson's trying to force me out by hurting innocent people. Catherine stood up, reaching for her coat. Then we go get her back. We? Samuel stared at her. Catherine, these men are dangerous. You can't. Can't what? Her eyes flashed with anger. Can't help because I walk with a crutch? Can't fight because I'm a woman? Or can't be trusted because I'm not rich enough to matter? The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. That's not what I meant, isn't it? Catherine limped toward the door. You've been back for a month, Samuel. You've fixed buildings and hired workers and thrown money around like seeds. But when it comes to real danger, you still think like the rich man from California who solves problems by himself. She was right, and they both knew it. Samuel had been trying to save the valley the same way he'd built his business empire, by controlling everything and trusting no one completely. I'm scared, he admitted quietly. I've already lost my parents. I can't lose you too. Catherine's expression softened. You won't lose me, but you might lose yourself if you keep trying to carry every burden alone. 20 minutes later, they rode through the storm toward Henderson's ranch, accompanied by Pete Harrison and 6 other men who'd answered Tommy's desperate calls for help. The boy had insisted on coming, despite Samuel's objections, riding behind Pete on the old carpenter's horse. The Henderson place sprawled across a hill like a small fortress, its windows glowing yellow against the storm-dark sky. They could see Mrs. Miller tied to a post in the front yard, rain soaking through her thin nightgown as she slumped unconsciously against her bonds. They want us to see her, Pete observed grimly. This is a trap. Samuel studied the scene. Maybe, but we can't leave her there. I can get closer than any of you, Catherine said suddenly. They won't expect a woman on a crutch to be a threat. Before Samuel could object, she dismounted and begun working her way through the darkness toward the house. The storm provided cover, but Samuel's heart hammered as he watched her disappear into the shadows. Minutes stretched like hours until they saw Catherine signal a brief flash of light from behind the house. She'd found another way in. What happened next unfolded like a carefully planned dance. Catherine appeared in an upstairs window and began lowering a rope made from bedsheets. Pete and 2 others used the distraction to circle around behind the barn. Samuel and the remaining men approached from the front, making enough noise to draw attention. Henderson, Samuel called out as he rode into the yard. Let's finish this. The front door opened, and 3 men emerged with rifles. Henderson himself stood on the porch, his face twisted with rage. You should have stayed in California, Cross. This valley doesn't need your kind of help. What kind is that? Samuel dismounted slowly, his hands visible but ready. The kind that builds schools? The kind that helps sick women and hungry children? The kind that thinks money can buy respect, Henderson snarled. Your father was a failure, and so are you. The words were meant to hurt, but instead they filled Samuel with a strange calm. You're right, he said. My father did fail at some things. He failed to make his ranch profitable. He failed to save enough money for hard times. But he never failed to help a neighbor in need. He never failed to treat people with dignity. And he never failed to teach his son the difference between right and wrong. While Henderson was focused on Samuel's words, Catherine had managed to free Mrs. Miller and help her toward the horses. But their escape didn't go unnoticed. "Stop them!" Henderson shouted. What followed wasn't the dramatic gunfight Samuel had feared, but something far more powerful. As Henderson's men raised their rifles, they found themselves surrounded not just by Samuel's small group, but by 20 other valley residents who'd been watching from the darkness. "Put the guns down, Henderson," came a voice from the shadows. Sheriff Keller stepped into the light, but this time, his badge wasn't backing the wrong side. "The territorial governor got some interesting letters about your business practices. Seems like someone's been paying attention to who really owns what around here." Henderson's face went white. "You can't prove anything." "Don't have to," Keller replied. "Your own account books tell the story well enough. Turns out stealing from widows and orphans is still illegal, even when you own the bank." As Henderson and his men were led away, Samuel found himself standing in the middle of the yard, surrounded by neighbors who'd risked their own safety to help him. These weren't people impressed by his wealth or his California success. They were people who'd watched him work alongside them, who'd seen him care for their children and their sick. "Why?" he asked Pete quietly. "Why did you all come?" The old carpenter smiled. "Because you came home, boy. Really came home. Not just to the place, but to the people. Your pa would be proud." 2 months later, Samuel and Catherine stood before the new schoolhouse as Mrs. Miller rang the bell for the first time. Tommy Miller was indeed the first student through the door, followed by 15 other children whose faces shone with possibility. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked, her hand slipping into Samuel's. Samuel looked out over the valley where he'd been born, where he'd learned to work and love and lose and hope. His fine California clothes had been replaced by simple work shirts and sturdy boots. His soft hands were now calloused and strong. His bank account was smaller, but his life was infinitely richer. "Just one," he said, pulling her close. "That it took me so long to understand that the treasure I was looking for was never buried somewhere else. It was growing right here all along, waiting for me to come home and help it bloom." The school bell continued to ring across the valley, calling children to learn and grow, while their parents worked land that now belonged not to distant banks but to the people who loved it. And in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church, 2 weathered crosses stood guard over graves surrounded by wildflowers, proof that some things love, family, home are worth more than all the gold in California.